Welcome to the show. Tom, I want to start with a picture, not a business term. 16th century France, a wall with a carved recess in it, and inside that recess, there is room for exactly one sculpture.
One sculpture. So the word niche started as literal wall real estate?
Exactly. A niche was that recessed space in architecture, built to frame one specific piece of art in one exact place. Not a storage shelf, not a jumble, not let's put 7 things in there and hope one works. One thing deliberately chosen, presented so you couldn't miss it.
Well, that's already better than half the marketing advice on the internet. Be everything to everybody is basically the opposite of a 16th century French wall.
It really is. And that's why I love this. We talk about finding your niche like it's some trendy business school concept from, I don't know, the 1980s. But the image underneath it is about 500 years old. People understood the power of making space for one thing long before they ever used the word in marketing.
500 years is the part that sticks for me. You're telling me architects had this figured out centuries before consultants started printing glossy brochures.
Yes, and I think it tells us something important. Useful ideas usually show up in the real world before they show up in business books. A niche wasn't abstract. It was physical. You carved out space, you defined the boundaries, and because the boundaries were clear, the thing inside mattered more.
That's good, because people here go narrow and they assume smaller means weaker. But a niche in a wall isn't weak. It's intentional. It says, this belongs here. That's strong positioning, whether it's a statue or a business.
Right, and that old image helps explain why broad marketing so often falls flat. If you try to serve everybody, your message gets mushy. Nobody feels seen. But if you know exactly who you're helping, all of a sudden your language gets sharper, your offer gets clearer, and people recognize themselves in what you're saying.
Let me try to say that back in plain English. If I walk into a room and say I can help anyone with anything, people hear noise. If I say I help retired salespeople turn their experience into consulting income, now I've put the sculpture in the recess.
Yes, that's exactly it. Same business brain, same experience, but now it is framed. And once it's framed, it becomes easier to market, easier to refer, easier to charge for. Specificity does not shrink value. It concentrates it.
I spent decades in sales. The fastest way to disappear is to sound generic. The minute a prospect thinks, he's just another one of those, you're done. But if they think, oh, this is for people like me, now you've got a conversation.
And that's the little surprise tucked inside the word itself. A niche was never about limitation for limitation's sake. It was about proper placement. The right thing in the right space, so the right person notices it.
I did not know that, and I hate how perfect it is. Architecture accidentally gave us one of the best business metaphors there is.
That old architectural idea gets even more interesting once the internet shows up. In 2004, Chris Anderson, who was editing Wired magazine at the time, was studying Amazon sales data and noticed something strange. Books that sold only a handful of copies were still producing serious money when you added them all together.
Wait, 2004, Amazon, and the weird part is the tiny sellers, not the best sellers?
Not the hits, that's the point. In a physical bookstore, shelf space is limited, so the store has to bet on what moves fast. A book that sells 10 copies or 20 copies probably never makes the shelf. But Amazon didn't have that same shelf space problem. It could carry the obscure fishing guide, the out-of-print history title, the hyper-specific cookbook, all of it.
So the 10-copy book and the 20-copy book and the 15-copy book, those little drips added up to more than the big front table stack.
Collectively, yes. That's what Anderson called the long tail. Instead of all the money being concentrated in a few blockbuster titles, there was this long, trailing curve of niche products that, together, could outperform the hits. Once distribution gets cheap and shelf space basically disappears, small demand stops being a problem.
The phrase "the long tail" I knew. I did not know it came out of Amazon book data in 2004. That's one of those observations that changes how you see an entire industry.
It really did. because once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Netflix doesn't just need one movie everybody likes. Spotify doesn't just need the top 40. YouTube doesn't just thrive on viral stars. All three lean on recommendation systems that help people find exactly the weird, narrow, specific thing they want.
And the recommendation engine is what unlocks it, right? Because if there are 10,000 niche things, the problem isn't making them. The problem is helping the right person find number 7,483.
Yes, exactly. No shelf space limit matters, but discoverability matters too. Once platforms got good at saying, if you liked this, you'll probably like that, niche demand became scalable. That's why the internet rewards businesses that are specific instead of broad. It can connect odd little pockets of demand across geography and time.
And that's where a solo entrepreneur needs to stop thinking like a department store. You don't need millions. You don't need foot traffic in a mall. You need enough of the right people to say, finally, somebody made this for me.
That is such a helpful mindset shift, especially for our listeners. If you're starting later in life, audience size can feel intimidating. You think, I don't have a huge following. I don't know thousands of people. But the long tail lesson says you may not need a huge audience at all. You need a clear audience.
Let me put numbers to it without getting fancy. If you try to sell a cheap, vague thing to everybody, you need massive volume. If you solve a sharp problem for a very specific group, your marketing gets cheaper and your price can go up. That's a much better business for one person.
And it's more humane, honestly. You're not shouting into the void, hoping strangers notice you. You're speaking directly to people with a real problem you understand. That's easier to write, easier to sell, easier to sustain.
Also easier on the nerves. I'd rather have 1,000 people who really want what I'm offering than 100,000 people vaguely scrolling past me while eating potato chips.
Same. And if anyone wants the larger lesson this Fun Facts episode connects to, the full training is at go.thewisdomadvantage.org. Because this is where niche thinking stops being theory and starts becoming an actual business decision. All right, so let's put real companies and real people on this. Lululemon started in Vancouver in 1998, and Chip Wilson made a choice that a lot of advisors would have called foolish. He built the brand around women doing yoga. Not fitness in general. Not everybody who owned sneakers. Women in yoga studios.
1998. And he deliberately ignored the larger market because on paper that sounds like turning down money.
It does sound that way. And people pushed him to broaden out early, especially with a men's line. But he kept saying no. He didn't add men's products until 2014, 16 years after founding the company. By then, Lululemon was worth over $8 billion.
16 years is the token there. Most people can't stay focused for 16 weeks. He said no to half the market for 16 years and built an $8 billion brand first.
Because the focus was the brand. Women in that specific community felt seen. The store experience, the product, the language, all of it said, this is for you. And once a brand earns that kind of trust, expansion gets easier later.
You earn the right to go broad by proving you can go deep. That's the lesson. Too many people try to launch broad before they've built any authority anywhere.
And if Lululemon is the polished version of niche strategy, Colonel Sanders is the scrappy, heartbreaking version. Harlan Sanders had a small roadside restaurant in Corbin, Kentucky. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He just had one recipe and one method he believed in: pressure-fried chicken that could cook in 8 minutes instead of 30.
8 minutes instead of 30. That's not a small improvement. That's the whole business. Faster service, same product. Very specific method.
Exactly. Then, in 1955, a new highway bypassed his town. Traffic vanished. The restaurant closed. He was 65 years old, basically broke, living off a Social Security check. So he put his pressure cooker in the car and drove from restaurant to restaurant, cooking for owners and asking for a nickel on every chicken sold with his method.
65, Social Security check, sleeping in the car. That part is going to stay with people.
It stayed with me too, and most of them said no. Over the next 2 years, he got rejected more than 1,000 times. More than 1,000. But he knew exactly what he was offering. Not food in general, not maybe I can consult on your menu. Fried chicken, this recipe, this process, this result.
1,000 rejections with one clear offer beats 10 vague offers with no traction. That's hard medicine, but it's true.
And by 1964, 9 years after that restaurant closed, KFC had more than 600 locations. He sold the company at 74. So when someone says, I started too late, I think, maybe what you really mean is, I haven't gotten specific enough yet.
That's the reframing right there. People obsess over speed because speed feels youthful. But business isn't won by speed alone. It's won by clarity, repetition, patience. Sanders had one recipe. Wilson had one customer. They didn't rush to look big. They got unmistakable first.
And that's encouraging, especially if you're listening at 55, 65, 70. You do not need to become everything overnight. You need to know what your one sculpture is, who your one group is, and why your one method works.
If there's a takeaway here, it's simple. Broad sounds safer, but specific usually wins. And later is not too late. Not if you know where you fit.
I'm Anna Morgan.
And I'm Tom Morgan. Stay curious.